Hello, welcome to another Seeing Clearly with Charlotte Giblin, and oh, look at this. So if you saw the previous one, you will have an idea of what this painting is all about. And I'm just going to give you a reminder on a little A4 piece of paper what this painting looked like before. I mean, look at the contrast. Do you remember the story about letting go? About me trying to let the paintbrush do the work and all those creepy forest fingers? Well, that transformed into that. Slightly different feeling, right? Look, it's like obviously the colours have completely changed. We're now bright yellows, rich oranges and reds, and so much sunshine in the grass. The colour is so much happier than the previous version. And all of the dark shadows, even though the light is still incredibly realistic, the shadows are created by maroons and magentas, dark blues and really deep greens, none of the purpley blacks that I had in the original version. Now, there is a story, of course, attached to the enormous change. I'm going to sit here because it feels like such a lovely healing painting, with now the fingers are kind of dancing over my head as opposed to creepy grabbing fingers like something out of Lord of the Rings. Although that's relatively appropriate being in New Zealand. But anyway, it feels to me a bit like Dr. Zeus. And for a long time in my art talks, I would refer to myself as a fine art Dr. Zeus. I mean, this kind of animated life was what I wanted to see in my paintings. This is the Charlotte I wanted to know existed and I wanted to show to the world, not the previous version, which felt like an alien channeled version of something really dark and mysterious within me. But if I hadn't looked at that dark, mysterious shadow version of myself, I would never have been able to journey to this much happier version. And you cannot get a clearer distinction between Charlotte, the previous version of Charlotte, to the post version of Charlotte. And what happened in between was that I left New Zealand and went on holiday. And it's about perspective. This is about gaining perspective, physical distance if you need to, from your problems, and being able to view them with a bigger picture perspective, being able to step back and look at all of the information with a very different eye. Now, you don't have to travel halfway around the world, as I did, from New Zealand to the UK, to gain perspective on your problems. Sometimes it's a case of just stepping away for half an hour, going for a walk, having a chat with a friend, just removing yourself from the intensity of the problem, or gaining perspective by writing things down. That has always helped me. Seeing the problem written down can feel like you're taking it out of yourself, almost like you're reading someone else's story, and it can remove the emotional involvement and the pressure that you feel in that moment. There are so many different devices which are incredibly helpful for gaining perspective. It's a well-known tool for sorting out all kinds of issues that you might feel. And some people do need to physically remove themselves from a situation, and I did at that stage. And this was back in 2016 when I was 41. Remember in my previous story when I was expecting the brush to do the work and move on of its own accord, 41. I should really keep that to myself, shouldn't I? But no, I know it helps other people. Know that they're not the only one who expects magic and crazy things to happen and has way too high expectations for themselves. I'm not the only one, I keep telling myself. I was at a very critical point in my life, in my relationship. I was expecting to go to the UK and not to return to New Zealand, where my partner and my life were. And I was going with that knowledge. I was going on this holiday. I left for 6 weeks. The longest I'd been away prior to that was 3.5 weeks. There's my partner who was working as a chef at the time, and he's New Zealander, and he had travelled enough. It's a long way from anywhere being in New Zealand. It's a really difficult journey, flying, 37 hours travelling, whatever it is altogether. And I don't mind doing it because of my roots, my family connections in the UK. But Pete was just over any travel. So I would always go on my own, which suited us both really, really well, both very independent. And it gave me a chance to see my friends and my family without having to think about him, worrying about what he was doing. And it gave us both a bit of space, which can be really, really healthy in a relationship. But I was going with the secret knowledge that I wasn't going to return. And while I was in the UK, I spent a lot of time really thinking about my situation, really thinking about my relationship, asking myself, why was I still in a relationship that was making me unhappy? There was a lot of fear involved there with myself. I was fearful of his actions, of his words. And talking to friends and writing about it and getting this honest perspective that I keep talking about with the seeing clearly aspect of this whole program, if you like, but also with the way as artists, how important it is to develop a clear, critical, honest eye when we're looking at something that we want to draw realistically, when we're learning how to translate it onto paper. Having a detached perspective from the subject that we're focusing on is incredibly helpful as an artist. And I started using this tool to really address my own behavior honestly. And it was very painful because what I discovered, and let's think about the grabbing, dark, creepy, shadowy forest, was that I realised, if I was completely honest with myself, that a great deal of the problems that I was having in my relationship were my fault. I was responsible because I wasn't being honest. That's a really hard thing to say. It's also a really difficult thing to acknowledge and to know. And I did a lot of soul searching on that trip and thought to myself, well, you know what? If I'm going to give the relationship any chance, and I believe this is true of any of our relationships, and I've had plenty of opportunities to test this with other relationship dynamics. If one person in the relationship is not being honest, how can it possibly be given a chance to genuinely blossom and grow? And that's all good and well until you realise that you're the person who is responsible for the dishonest half. And there wasn't any kind of infidelity going on. There was nothing like that. Absolutely, the bedrock of trust in our relationship with the bedrock of trust has always been there. But I wasn't being honest about the problems that I was experiencing within the relationship dynamic. I was repeating patterns of behavior that I'd been experiencing my entire life, making sure everybody else was okay before me. That is my thing. If you know any of my videos, you'll know I've had a taken on a role of responsibility, well, up until recently, where I no longer have that role. I have shed that problem, which has been amazing, totally transformed my life. And this was the first major part of that recovery, was taking responsibility for the fact that I was still playing this role of putting everyone else first and being afraid to be honest about how I felt. I was afraid to admit because I didn't want there to be any controversy. I didn't want there to be any conflict because I'd seen what happened with conflict in many of the relationship dynamics I'd experienced previously, not in romantic relationships with myself, but the lack of emotional control my mum had with her mental health issues and connected to her anorexia. Many of the issues and relationships I saw where there, and with my partner as well, with some of the emotional control problems that he had in his very stressful job as a chef. And I always took it because that was the role that I'd learned to play. I sucked it all in and absorbed it because I knew I had this incredible wellspring of energy and light within me that would always heal me from within. And I knew I could go for a walk, I could escape into one of my amazing imaginative worlds, I could listen to some music, I could talk to a friend, and I'd be fine. I knew I had this resource. And because of that, I saw it as my job to absorb other people's anger and frustration, to deal with it, and then move on. But this was becoming a real problem for me. It was really hindering any kind of development, any kind of emotional development. I was, if you know any of my stories, I was becoming increasingly unwell physically. My body was manifesting all of the stress as regular illness and difficult physical symptoms. And I knew that I had to take responsibility and ownership for my own behavior and my own reactions if I was going to have any chance of changing my life. And so I came back to New Zealand and I had some of the most difficult conversations I've ever had. Felt sick, was close to fainting. Actually, first of all, saying to my partner, I'm leaving, I'm done. I actually thought this was the answer. This was the way to do it. Just don't even address it. Just, right, done, cut off, start again. But I absolutely knew that if I didn't address these issues, they would simply present in another relationship. This was my problem. I needed to start standing up for myself, to start being honest about what wasn't right for me. Start putting my foot down, to start developing my confident voice again, even if it was inconvenient for the people around me. And you know what happened? Nothing bad, other than my abject fear of rejection, of conflict, of angry words, and all of the churning up inside before having those difficult conversations. And after I said to my partner, right, I'm done, right, it's gone, right, and I actually nearly vomited, and my brain, my body, made me start to faint. Obviously, there was part of my subconscious going, quick, stop her from talking. This is all wrong. Pass her out. Make her go unconscious so she can't finish that sentence. And my partner was absolutely horrified because I'd done such a good job of convincing myself and him that everything was okay. And not only was it okay, he thought the relationship was going really, really well. And it was, if you just look at the surface and everything I'd been saying. And I'd done such a great acting job that nobody thought, other than the close friends I was talking to and my journal, nobody thought there was a problem. Or the people who were directly involved, like my partner, had no idea there was a problem. So how can somebody be given an opportunity to change and evolve if you never tell them there's an issue? If you just run away from the problem without the confrontation? And admittedly, there are plenty of circumstances where that is really, really hard to do. And there was never any violence. That's very, very, very important point. It was only ever psychological, emotional, my own fears from situations that I'd experienced before and the way that I dealt with it. But I never stood up and said, actually, hang on, that's not good enough for me anymore. And I'm not quite happy with, your tone, or now don't speak to me like that. All the different no's that are really, really hard to say. But the hardest part of it really was acknowledging that I was at fault because I hadn't had the confidence, I hadn't found the courage to be honest in this situation. And so essentially, it meant a renewal of it, like a starting fresh from this new platform in the relationship, where I was very tentatively, very slowly being truthful about the way I felt, about how trapped I felt in a treadmill with my work, with my the role I was playing domestically. I felt I was just doing way too much around the house and playing all of these different roles, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. Hence the creepy forest with its grabbing fingers, clawing at me, which helped me to understand. You don't need to paint a creepy forest with dark, dark, dark shadows in it to know that there's something amiss that you need to address. And so there's so many different ways of discovering your own perspective with writing, with talking, with just, if something's not right, if it's creating an illness and a constant stress and an adrenaline pumping surge within you all of the time. And that's what was happening to me. So I found the courage to start being honest about what felt more right for me. And it was this gradual process that I've spoken about before of thinking about a situation and what should I do, this or should I do that? Should I say this? Should I say that? And thinking about just the simplicity of two options. And one of them would always just feel a little bit better, a little bit brighter, as I've said before. And I would always go towards the brighter one. I started trusting my intuition more, but also trusting that if I was doing things that were right for me, that felt good for me, that they would also be right for all of the people immediately around me who were impacted by me, who were affected by me. Because if I am operating in a much more positive way that is authentic to my own needs and my own well-being, that is obviously going to affect the people around me positively as well. And if it doesn't, if they are not wanting me to be happy and to feel well, then clearly that's a whole different issue. But what I discovered was that I was able to start rebuilding my relationship from a very different perspective of honesty, which is nuts, isn't it? We think that we're being really honest with people around us, or we think we're protecting them by telling them half-truths, or we want to say things we don't want to hurt people. So we choose our words really carefully. But I'd got into a pattern of so not wanting to hurt my partner or say something which I was afraid might trigger a mood or an outburst, that I wasn't telling the truth at all. I was finding a really soft way to say everything, which turns out he could tell, and he was longing for me to discover my confident voice again. And somehow over all these years together, I'd lost that, and I'd regressed into this pattern of behavior where I consistently reacted in the same way. I consistently chose to absorb other people's anger, hide my own fear, hide my own desires, because that was the role I played. And I didn't want to change that identity. I didn't want to threaten that identity because I didn't know what was going to happen. And everything since then, from that huge step of acknowledging my own responsibility, the very, very difficult step of saying, you know what, I hold my hands up, I'm the one who's at fault here, and let's see what I can do about it, because I have complete control over my own actions and reactions. So what happens if I change them? And I did. And gradually, our relationship, there was a bit of a difficult period immediately after me saying I wanted to leave, and then, okay, hang on, I don't. Now I've realised the seriousness of that statement, and the fact that I think I probably just needed to say it just to hurt him, because I'd felt hurt so many times. I wanted to just lash out and get back at him. And it worked. He was really hurt. And at that moment, I had this incredible clarity of, oh my goodness, I am just about to lose the real love of a man right in front of me. I'm just about to absolutely, desperately hurt him and completely change my life forever because I'm afraid to tell the truth. That is quite a powerful statement. And from that point, there was a fair bit of rebuilding of his trust. And we have gradually worked through that. And how many years later? 8 years later? 7 years later? The relationship is in a completely different place. From that point onwards, that one decision, after maybe 6 months or a year, it got easier and easier and easier for me to say what was the right thing for me to choose different reactions, and not the fearful hiding reaction, but claiming my own voice. And it does take time. And it's still, for a while, it felt really nerve-wracking saying no or standing up for myself. Then it got really easy. And so I think of our relationship almost like the first 7 years or so. We've been together about 15 years now. The first 7 years or so were really challenging because I was a very different version of myself. And then there was this gate which I opened and walked through. And since then, it's just got better and better and better. And we are in just the most fantastic place now together. And there have been many challenges, and we keep on working at it. But how can you give a relationship a chance if you're not being honest? And if your not being honest thing is that you shouldn't be in that relationship, what is stopping you from leaving? But if you're not being honest is that you're simply not acknowledging some of your own long-held reactions and behavioural patterns, negative behavioural patterns that are holding you back, it's so disrespectful to yourself and to the other person. You're not honouring either of you by keeping yourself in that little merry-go-round. I know how hard it is to face those issues. I also know what a remarkable transformation it has had. And so 6 months after creepy painting, I did this. And you can see how much I've changed in that 6 months just from this painting. With the animated, soft way now, the branches, they seem to be healing this stump. They're not grabbing at it. There's like a magic and a playfulness now to the whole painting. The whole background is filled with sunshine and hope in a way that the previous version didn't have. It's such a visceral illustration of the change that happened. And it started with admitting that I was wrong and making a decision to do something about it. Now, there is some serious food for thought. Thank you so much for your time. I'll see you in the next one.